So at this point, we've got our models set up. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create our routes. So we've got our tests set up here. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up a start script that'll end up starting our application. And what we're going to need here is we're going to put in a URL string for our database. We're going to call this database URL. And we'll call nodemon, and we're going to call it server.js. So we'll create these two files, server.js and app.js. And our app.js is going to have our express module, so we'll need to go and save that. And at this point, we'll see that they end up getting added. And we can end up creating our express application, and we can end up exporting it. And we can end up just seeing that this works by just setting up one route and just doing a response.render. And again, we're going to have to set up our rendering engine and that sort of thing. And what we can do is that since we're not using super tests, we're actually just going to test this by running it. We're not writing tests for these routes. We could go and create our server. And we can do that by calling create server and requiring our app. And we're going to have our app listen on a port. And we'll specify that either the environment will pass a port or we will use 3000. And we'll just do a console.log just to show that our application is running. And when we end up doing this, we can start. But if we do this, we'll find out that we don't have any default engine. So we can end up installing Swig. And we could bring it in. We could end up setting the defaults. And we're also going to set up these views. So we'll have a layout page, and we'll also have our index page for our home page. And on our layout page, we'll specify a block for our content. Put in some HTML. And we'll put in a title attribute, which will end up getting passed to the view. And our index page will extend our layout page. And on this page, we can just put a message. And when we go to run this, still going to have the same issue. And the reason for that is because we didn't end up specifying that we were setting up an HTML engine that's going to use a Swig render file method, and also we want to set our view engine to HTML. And at this point, we've got things set up, but let's actually bring in Bootstrap so we have a little bit of styling here. And we can do that by adding this to the layout page. And we're also going to need to go and we're going to need to get Bootstrap. So one of the things you could do here is you could actually see that Bootstrap didn't end up loading here. We can see that we have an error that it couldn't find that style sheet. But if we end up going back and we install Bootstrap, it'll automatically end up getting put in the node modules folder. Then we could set up an express static route, and we could use path.join. So we're not concatenating strings on our own. And we could go in and bring in our path module. And if we do that, we should see that we'll have a little bit of styling within our application. So let's actually start setting up a nav bar with our application. We're going to have 3 tabs. we're going to have a tab for home. We're also going to have one for going to department, and we'll also have one for customers. So one of the things that we want to do is that when you end up clicking on the department tab, that you end up going to the default department. So we want to show what this default department is, and we also want to set up our link so it ends up going to this default department. And right now we can see that there's no default department. We're not actually passing it to the view. But now if we end up going in and we end up bringing in our models, so we can go up to our DB, we could get our models, and we could end up getting our department model. And we can go in here, and what we can do is specify that we're going to get our default. So we've got this method that even if the default department doesn't exist, it'll end up getting created. And we could put our catch here. It's always good to do that so you catch any errors. And here we could pass in our default department. And now we run into other problems. This is the first time that we've actually hit the database. So there's an issue here that our database doesn't exist. And we can go in and we could create that database. Now this is only going to be one part of the problem, because now if we reload, we're going to find out that we don't have any tables in the database. Now we do have this, if you recall, we do have this sync method that we ended up using for our testing, and our sync method will go and actually create the database tables. We ended up using this in our testing. We'll go back and take a look at it again. So I'm just going to set a task up here that allow me to go in and get those tables created. And I'm going to go into my server file, and I'm going to put in here, hey look, if sync exists, I'm going to end up calling sync. And this really should be a one-time thing for a database. Again, you might do this a lot in your testing environment, and we're doing it already in our testing environment. But now we could bring it in here, and if sync is defined, we can end up getting our tables generated. And this will work well when we end up going in deploying our application. So now if we run this again, we could actually see our tasks that we could run, and we run sync, and we kill it, and we go back and we run start dev. Now our tables should be created, and we can see that we do have our default department. So now we can actually start bringing in our other routes. So this route doesn't exist yet, right? We'll get this error that it can't find these departments, but we could go in and we could start setting up these routes. So this is going to be our departments route. And again, we'll do our standard thing by going in and creating the router. And we'll go in here and we'll bring in our models, which we're going to need. So here's we'll bring in our department model. And we can end up setting up our route here. That's, again, it's going to end up getting passed in our department ID. And we can end up using the find by ID method, using our request params object. We've got our department. Put our catch here. And this is models. Remember to put our parameters here. And we could see our department, but let's actually send it out, response.send. And here's our department. Now one thing that we're going to want to get from the departments is actually to get the users that are in the department. Again, because a user has a department ID, so we're going to need the model itself. But we run into a problem here because there's no connection that goes from the department to the user. So if we go back and look at our model, we'll see that the user has a connection to the department, but we have to specify that the department has many users, and this way we could end up doing the include, and at this point we could see that this department doesn't have any users. But once we have our department, we're also including our users. And what we're going to do here is that we're going to bring in Bluebird to make our life a little bit easier here. And what we can end up doing here, because there's a couple of things that we want to end up getting. And the order is not necessarily critical here, but what we want to do is we want to end up getting the department that we're going to be looking at. And also, we want to get a list of the other departments so that you could navigate to the other departments. And on top of that, we want to get the default department because we need to show that on that main tab. So what the spread operator does is that instead of getting one result and looking at it by indexing it, what you end up doing is you spread the results out. So the order that they go in, we'll be able to get the department, the departments, and the default department. And if we go and look at that, and this is going to be get default, you can see that we've got these three objects. And what we're going to end up doing, instead of sending them, we're going to end up generating a view for them. So this doesn't exist yet, but we could go and end up creating it. And while we're doing it, let's just think about some of the things that we're going to be able to do for a department. One of the things we want to do for a department is to be able to add employees to a department. So on this departments page, which we're creating now, we'll set this up so that we have an input. And we're going to allow the ability to actually go and create. And excuse me, in this case, what we're going to actually do, this we're putting on the index page, and we're going to give the ability to actually create a department. So we'll do this, we'll set up this route so that we have the ability to go and create a department. Right now we just have this one department, but we want to be able to go here on our home page, and we would like to be able to go in here and we'd like to generate a department here. Let me just do a little housekeeping here to make this look a little bit nicer. Put a little space here so that we've got a little margin. And so before we start, we could do this in a couple of different orders, but let's set this up so that we actually have a post route to create a department. So this is going to be a post. And what we're going to do is we'll pass this in. We'll use the request body. We'll put our catch over here. This is the department that'll end up getting created. And we'll redirect back to that department that got created. So the problem that we run into is that we don't have body parser configured. So let's bring in body parser. Again, this doesn't get configured in an individual router. This gets configured for the application. And we could bring it in, and since this is a form submission, we're going to do body parser URL encoded, extended as false. There's a couple of different body parsers that gets used. This is the more simplistic one. And let's fix this. Now if we go in here, we can end up creating a department, and now we could start focusing a little bit more on our view so that instead of just sending this object back, we'll actually do a render, and we'll render a department's view, which we could end up creating. So here's our department's view. This is actually just going to be a view of one department, but eventually we'll be able to navigate to different departments. And here, now we're also going to have a form here, but this form is going to allow us to add an employee to the department. So in order to do a RESTful route, we'll specify that we're posting to departments, the department ID, and employees, because what we're really doing here is creating an employee. So when we end up going here, we're going to want to be able to put an employee in. And the other things that we want to do is that we want to loop over our employees. So remember, we're passing in a department. A department has a collection of users, and again, that's from our relationship that says a department has many users, and we could loop over those users, and for each user, we'll create a list item and just show that user's name. And by default, this is going to be blank, but we want to be able to add someone. This doesn't exist yet. So we'll go into our routes, our departments route, and we're going to set up a post. And here we're going into the actual department, but we're actually posting to an employee. And so this is a pretty restful route. We're creating an employee. The employee is going to have this department, which we're getting from the params, and a name that we're getting from the body. And we're actually just going to redirect back to this departments page for that particular department. So now we've got a user. And we can go and redirect back to this department, and we'll put our catch here. And so now we should have the ability to add employees to a department. We have to remember to pass in these params. And so that works. We could end up creating these employees. Let's also start to set this up so that we have the ability to delete an employee. So again, we're going to use RESTful routes. So now we've got the employee, and we're going to end up doing a delete. And we'll do this with our method override because we can't do this directly with a form. But again, the important thing is our route, the department ID, the employees, then the ID of the employee. So this route doesn't exist, but you notice that this is still looking for a post. So what we're going to do is use our method override. And we're going to go and configure it. Again, this usually gets configured with body parser. Bring it in. And we'll end up using our method override, and the parameter that it's going to look for is underscore method. And now when we go and delete, it'll actually say, hey, look, I'm looking for this delete route, which is what we want. So now, if we end up going back to our departments route, we're going to set up our router. This is going to be the department ID, and this will be the ID of the employee. And it's good that we have that department ID because that's what we'll end up redirecting back to. And here we're going to use our user model. We're going to destroy where the ID is going to be equal to the ID of the parameter that was passed in. And this is going to be a promise. We'll put our catch here. And if we're successful at doing the deleting, we'll redirect back to this particular department, which we have the ID from the parameter. And so if this is set up correctly, we should be able to delete and add our employees. So we've got a couple of these RESTful routes that are here. So the next thing we could do is let's start focusing on how our customers are going to work. So we'll have this customers tab that doesn't exist yet. We're going to want to go and create a router for this. So we'll create this customers route. Again, standard stuff. We're going to need to go and bring our models in. We're going to need our user. And again, we're calling this a customer, but a customer is really just a user that doesn't have a department ID. And we'll end up exporting the router. We'll do a get. So we're going to need to find our customers. So we're going to do a find all, and we're going to specify, hey, look, we only want the ones that do not have a department ID. And just for starters here, we'll just see that we could end up getting a result that it'll find that route. And we shouldn't, at this point, have any customers, have any users that don't have department IDs. So this is just an empty array. What we really want to do is this is one of the 3 views that we end up rendering. And we're going to want to pass back our customers. We also want to pass back our default department as well, because we really end up using that on our layout page when someone ends up going to the departments page. So we're going to break this up a little bit. We're going to use our spread operator. We're going to bring in our Bluebird library. And we could end up doing promise.all. And we're going to have our department get the default department. And the spread operator, again, spreads the results of those promises out. We could set up our customers page. Again, this is going to extend the layout page. And on the customers page, we could also have a form that'll end up getting used for creating a customer. And again, a customer, we could post to this customer's route, because in terms of RESTful routing, that makes sense to do. But behind the scenes, all we're doing is creating a user that doesn't have a department ID. So we'll set up our controls here. We've got our body parser set up already. We're not going to need to do that. We'll set up a placeholder, put a button here. To create a customer. And let's also go and loop over the customers that we have. And we'll put these list items and just show the names of our customers. And here we have to make sure that we put this in our content block, or else it won't end up showing up. So we want to have the ability to create a customer as well. So in our customers route, we're going to go and do a post. So this is going to be a post to /customers, in which case we'll end up creating a customer. And here we just need to redirect back to this customers page. So now if we're on the customers page, we could end up creating a customer. Let's just fix the styling here a little bit. And the other thing, let's do what we did on the departments page, where we want to have the ability to delete a customer. So again, we've got our method override already. This is going to be delete, and we're going to be passing the ID of the customer that we want to go and delete. And we'll make this a red button. And this route doesn't exist yet. You'll see again, it's looking for delete, and that's because of the method override here. Just do a little copying and pasting, make this a little faster. Delete, we're passing in an ID. And we're going to destroy, and this is going to be aware. The ID is the parameter that we're passing in here. And again, we're just going to redirect back to the customers page. So now we can create a customer, and we can end up deleting a customer as well. So the next thing we can do is we could set up the ability to actually make a department a default department. So what we could do is on the departments page, we could show whether or not it's the default department by looking at the default department, looking at the current department that we're on. And what we could end up doing is putting in a notification here if it is the default department, specifying that it's the default department. And if we go over here, we could look and see that since we only have one department here, this is our
default department. One other thing that we probably want to do here is that we haven't done is give the ability to navigate to various departments. So again, this is we have our main navigation, but we're also going to have some inner navigation to navigate between departments. We'll change the look here so that we'll end up using this pill look as opposed to the tabs which we have on the top. And here all we're doing is creating links that allow us to move between different departments. So we'll put down the name of the department. We have the department ID. And now if we're go to the departments page, we could see that we actually have two different departments. But what would also be nice is to pre-select, not pre-select, but to actually show what department we're on. So here I'm actually just changing this to underscore because what I want to actually do here is look at the current department, which we're passing in as department. And here I want to find out, hey, look, is the department that we're looping over the department that we're on. And this way we can show that we're either on accounting or that we're on engineering. And we can just give it a little bit of style so that we have a little bit of room to work with here. And we can navigate between our different departments. And the next thing that we're going to do is that we want to be able to change our data so that we can take a department and specify that it's going to be the default department. Now, the reason, again, why this is a little bit tricky is that we're going to have to take the current department and make sure that it's not the default department. And the way that we're setting this up here is we're setting it up just to keep this restful. We're setting it up and saying, hey, look, this is the only way that we end up updating departments. In a real world app, we'd also be able to update the department name and that sort of thing as well. But if we go over here, what we're going to hit, I just messed up here. This is going to be method of post. And if we do that, we'll see that it's looking for this put method that doesn't exist. So we could go back and put this in, and we're going to do a put. So again, this is our only avenue to update a department at this point. And what we're going to do is we're going to find the department by ID. And here's our department. And we'll put our catch here. And here we're going to go in. Now, luckily, we have this method that allows us to take a department and set it as the default department. We ended up doing this early on. And at this point, we can just redirect back to this department. And this should be our current department. So we could make engineering our current department. We could then switch it back to accounting. And so on and so forth. And the other thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that the first department that we get is always going to be our default department. So the ordering is a little bit weird to do, especially with Postgres, where sometimes you end up running into capitalization issues with Postgres. So when you're doing ordering, it's recommended that you do it this way, which is basically to specify that you're going to order something and you give it two values. So we're ordering by is default, and we're going to order, if we end up doing it in the descending direction, right, our default department will always end up showing up first. We could do it by ascending as well. And we don't really want to do that because we want the first department that shows up on that list to be the default department. So we say descending. And so now whenever we end up going and we end up changing a department back to the default department, it'll end up being the first department that's on the list. So we can go and we can add a customer. And the next thing that we'll end up taking a look at is right now we have no way of switching a user to an employee or back to a customer. So this is the next thing that we'll end up taking a look at. And again, the way that we're going to do this is we'll specify that this is going to be an update on a customer. And the update on the customer is to basically change it so that the department ID of that user is going to be the default department. So if we end up going into the router, this is going to be a put. And we'll go over here and we'll specify that what we're going to do is we're going to find this user by the ID. And all we're really doing here is we're going to go and we're going to set this user's department ID to whatever the default department is. So again, we've got sort of two things that we're going to go and find at this point. And again, we're going to use our Bluebird library just to make it a little bit easier to read. We could end up using spread. We could get the user and we could get the default department. And so we've got the default department. We're going to set the user's department ID to that default department. And then when we redirect back, since we still want to see the user, let's just redirect back to the departments. And in this case, we would end up, since we put the user in the default department, we would end up heading back to the default department. And so now this is going to give us the ability, if we have a customer, and we go ahead and here's our customer Fizz, and we decide to make Fizz an employee, we'll see that Fizz will show up underneath the default department. On the same token, what we also want to do is we want to be able to take an employee and turn that employee into a customer. So again, we're just going to treat this as a very simplistic editing of the employee, and our RESTful route is going to go through departments, employees, that particular employee ID, or I should say user ID. And here we're going to turn that user into a customer. And the way that we're going to end up doing it is that we're going to do sort of this is actually a little bit easier to do. And again, we're going to do this through departments. So we're in our departments router. We've got our department ID. Here's our employee that we're modifying. Again, that's why we're calling it a put. It's sort of a simple modification that we're doing. And here we're just going to go about finding the user. And once we end up finding the user, we're going to end up setting the user's department ID to null. And we'll save the user. We have to make sure to do that. We have to make sure that we end up returning. And then when we end up getting that user back, here it's a little bit easier because we're just going to redirect back to customers. And at this point, we could see that if we decide to make Mo a customer, he shows up under customers. So let's also just take a look at this, just clean this up a little bit. So one of the things that issues that we have is that if we move between tabs, we don't end up seeing those tabs on the top. So our main navigation works, but it would be great to show them where they are, whether they're on home, whether they're on a department, or whether they're on their customers page. So we'll set up this, a couple of different ways to do this, but a simple way that I like to do is just to have some kind of mode. And here we'll either have one of three modes. We'll either have home, departments, or customers, and we'll use our swig to put this default class in. And what we could do is just add this to our different models that we end up, sending back to swig. So now that we're on customers, we can end up pre-selecting it. And if we end up looking at departments, we could set the mode of departments. So now if you're on departments, you could see that you're on departments. And the last one that we'll do is in our app.js file, and we'll set our mode of home. So we could see that our navigation works a little bit better here. And we should also, since we have the ability to have a title, we should also add our titles here. We're actually within our layout where we're actually rendering the title. But we're going to want to render the title. So this is departments accounting and so on and so forth. And now you can see we have really most of the functionality done with our application. And we'll take a look at one other thing, which I think will help us out a bit. So right now, there's a little bit too much work that's being done in our routes. You could see, again, there's a lot of work that's being done in our model, but I think our route knows a little bit too much. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some methods to our model that'll help us do some work. So we're going to have this concept of a view model. View model is basically going to get all the information that we need and send it back to the render engine. So instead of putting all this logic in our router, what we're going to do is we're going to put this logic in our model and let our model do sort of our heavy lifting for us. And this way we could tell our class to get us our view model, and it'll deal with, making all the calls to the database that it needs to make. And here, again, we're not going to do any rendering here, but what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up getting all the data that we end up needing. And this way, what will end up happening here is that our router is going to become a lot easier to use, where we just pass this ID. This gets us our object. Again, I'm calling this our view model because this is a common term, and it's basically the data that's getting passed to our rendering engine so it could render it. And now we get to pull all this stuff out, and our router becomes a lot simpler to look at. And everything should work the same way. We just have to make sure that if we are using a promise, that we return this. And so now this works the same way, but just in terms of being able to test things out, it's a lot easier to test your models out than it is to test your routes. And we could always add a test for this. There's a couple of other places that we could look at and maybe benefit from this as well. So here we have our customer, and what we can do here is that we could also get this customer's view model, and we can end up passing this back into our page. If we end up getting the view model, it allows us to pull all this stuff out. And if we end up going back to our models, this is a class method that we'll end up putting on our user. And so now we end up just really not really passing anything in here. But we've got two promises that we're making. We're spreading out the results, and we end up passing back this object. So we're not rendering anything. We're just passing back this object that we're going to need for our view within a promise. And if we go and take a look at this and run this, so we have to make sure that we end up returning that promise. The other thing is that inadvertently I ended up putting in customer. We really don't have a customer model, even though we have this concept of a customer, but it's within the context of our user model. So if we go up here and we change this to user, this will end up working the same way. And again, it gives us the ability to have a much smaller footprint with our router. And there's a couple of other things we could do. So if we just sort of think about what this method is really doing, this method is creating an employee, right? And it's creating them by just passing in a parameter. So we could, again, thin this out a little bit, thinner routers, fatter models. And so we'll have a class method on our user that's going to allow us to generate an employee. And again, we'll use our promise.all. Again, we're passing in the ID. Our model has no concept of a request or a response. And this allows us to dry this out a little bit. And again, we've got to make sure that we end up returning this. So now we should have the ability to go and create an employee, which should work the same way. And let's take a look and see if there's some other ones that we could do here. So here's another one to create a customer, where again, we're just passing the ID here. And again, just pulling this out a little bit, again, makes it nice that we can end up testing it. If we were, creating a customer in other parts of our application or in other routes, we could end up doing that. But now our user object has the ability to do a bunch of different things, can create a customer, can create an employee, and this should end up working exactly the same way. So you can see we've sort of dried our routes up a little bit, which is nice, thinned them out a little bit. So right now, one thing that we don't have the ability to do is to delete a department. So let's do that. This adds a little bit of complexity here because the department is actually a parent entity, right? Because a user belongs to a department. So it's important what order you end up deleting things in. There's a couple of different ways to do this, but just to sort of keep this simple, when I go to delete a department, I'm also going to end up deleting the users that belong to this department. This is not as tricky as it seems because we do have this method to always ensure that we do have a default department. Right now, if we ended up setting up this route, it's not going to end up working because this doesn't exist. But we could go ahead and we could end up adding this route to our department where if we end up going to delete, we'll pass in the ID. And again, the first thing that we're going to have to do is remove all the users from that department. So we're going to use the destroy method. We're going to use a where. We're going to say, hey, look, we want to get rid of the users where the department ID equals the ID that was passed in. And again, this has to be a two-step process because once you end up deleting the users, you've gotten rid of the dependencies, and then you can end up getting rid of the parent. So now we can end up doing a destroy on the department itself. And when we end up doing that, at this point, we could just redirect back to our home page. Again, the nice thing about this is that we're going to be ensured a default department because we have that get default method, which will create the default department if it doesn't exist. So that is going to end up working out well for us. If we went ahead here and we ended up deleting this department, you see it ends up showing up. You'll see the ID ends up changing for this. So we delete the department, and we'll see that the ID for the default department ends up auto-incrementing here. But we could go ahead, and there's no problem to, we could add Mo, we end up deleting this department, and still our application doesn't break because whenever we end up asking for the default department, it'll create it if it doesn't exist. Now, again, here, our route is knows a little bit too much. So let's create a remove method on our department itself, which will remove the department and get rid of the users within the department. Right now, if we tried to do this, this wouldn't work. And what we can do here is we could set up an instance method, and this is going to be, a class method on our departments where we end up passing in the ID. And we're just going to take the logic that we had before and make sure we return a promise. And we can get rid of this. And so now our route becomes a bit thinner. And one thing we forgot to do here is that our model has no concept of a request object. So go back to our model, and we're just passing in the ID here. And this should end up working out as well. So again, it's nice that we've sort of dried this out a little bit. And here you can see, again, there's no application doesn't break when you end up deleting departments. So now we've got a completed application. Let's talk about deploying it. Now, one thing that I haven't done is create a Git repo. So let's actually turn this into a Git repo. Should have done this before. Should have actually considered deploying this before. But here's our repository. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify that I want to create a application on Heroku. And I don't have an internet connection, so let me just fix that. And now I can go and create on Heroku this application. Now, once I end up doing that, if I look at my remotes on Git, I'll see that I can push to Heroku. And I can push to Heroku my master branch. So I never even actually pushed this up from GitHub. I'm just using Git to actually specify what I want to push up to Heroku. And now when I do this, I could see the URL for Heroku. And what will often happen is when you first deploy something, there's something that you forgot to configure. And this Heroku logs comes in handy. And if I look at this, sometimes you forget dependencies. But what my issue is here is that it's looking for it's trying to create a connection to a SQLize object. But the problem is that I don't have Postgres set up with Heroku. So I'm going to go to Heroku, and I'm going to configure it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify that I want to add Postgres. And once I end up adding Postgres, you'll see that I have a URL for my database, and that's why I named that database URL. This automatically happens on Heroku. And now if I do this, I get a different error. And what's happening here is if I go and look at my errors, what I'll find out is that I don't have this relation departments. We saw this when we were developing as well. And the way that I'm going to do this, if you remember, in my application, in my server file, if in fact I find this sync value, it'll end up going and creating the table. So if I go over here and I add this and just set this to true, now my application should restart and I could test out my functionality by going in and doing various things, adding users to departments, making customers, creating departments, setting default departments, and all that will end up working. And one thing that I probably want to do here is that since my application might restart, I just want to make sure that it doesn't end up recreating those tables every time. That pretty much does it. So just to do a quick summary of what we've looked at here, and again, there's a lot of moving parts here, but if you break this down into smaller pieces and you start by, focusing on your models, which again will get built out to something that can be fairly complex, but they don't have to start out that way. But you have these building blocks, which are your models, which again, in the long run, they're going to do most of your heavy lifting for you. Your models end up getting used by your routes. We've got a couple of different routes here. Again, the routes themselves are fairly light. There's a fair amount of functionality here, but if we actually looked at our departments route, there's a couple of nested routes here in terms of dealing with employees. Again, things are spaced out here, but this is about 70 lines of code. It's not huge. If we look at our customers route, it's even smaller, about 40 lines of code. And again, things to sort of look out for as you're building out your applications, and things that I look out for when I look at people's code is that I want to make sure that there's not too much work that's being done within the routes for any number of reasons, because number one, you're not going to be able to reuse that functionality. and it's a little bit harder to test. So, you want your models to do the majority of the work. So you've got your individual routers that you've separated things out with, and those individual, the same way that the models are being used by the routes are being used by your application. So you could separate out functionality. You've got some configuration logic that's here, and then you've sort of separated out your server, which would give you the ability to do some testing of your routes, which we haven't done here. But we've got a little bit of a test suite where we're testing some functionality of our models. We ended up adding some functionality later in the game and introduced this concept of these view models, so that instead of making multiple calls to our database within our routes, we can have our model do that work and just pass back the object, which it could then end up using. So again, it's not a simplistic application, but again, you're not building it in one shot. You're building this out a little bit at a time, and that's the way to sort of get things done. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this assignment, and I'll see you on the next one.